This short lecture will provide an overview of community leadership and the different aspects of power and leadership at the community level. So we're going to start with a little bit of wisdom from the ancients. I have a background and have taught some of these particular philosophers, and the importance of both of them to city life and to community can't really be overstated. Plato advocated a concept called parrhesia, the idea that of frank speech, the idea that cities have to have the freedom for people to express themselves, not really like freedom of speech, but the ability to participate in real, true dialogue about issues. The Greek form of democracy was all about working together and working in a reciprocal manner with disagreements, but also moving forward collaboratively. Aristotle's ideas that really humankind can only find true fulfillment when they are in a community. The Greek word polis, or city-state, that the good life only exists when people are associated in community with others. His very famous phrase from his Politics, zoon politikon, human beings are political animals. And so these really important contributions of the Greeks, frank speech combined with a sense of community through civic republicanism and civic activism as a space to promote individual flourishing and happiness, really form the basis of why leadership at the community level is important. All of us will live in a community, and all of us will have a stake in the community and do things to promote the common good. This idea that justice is not something that's a private good for the powerful, that it's a public good for all to share. And so the benefit to the society, not just to the individual. And so there's this golden rule of communities, this balance of the individual and the community, and that's the respect to uphold society's moral order as you would have society respect to uphold your autonomy. One of the most important modern theorists is a gentleman who is still alive today, one of the most preeminent current living philosophers, Jürgen Habermas. Habermas's idea of communicative action is really instructive because it is very close to what Plato was talking about with parrhesia, this ideal of a deliberative democracy that he believes is really under threat. It's under threat for a lot of reasons, but in his estimation, in the times from around the 18th century Enlightenment until really the late 20th century, the deliberative democracy existed in different mechanisms. It existed in a public sphere that was a literary world, that was around coffee houses, was around the media, newspapers, and ways for people to gather to deliberate and communicate outside of their life worlds in a public sphere. And that public sphere created the public opinion that was connected to the legislature and to the system of democracy. His idea is that this communicative action is under threat for a lot of reasons, some of which might be communications revolutions of social media, globalization, and a lot of the impersonal aspects of human life that really have to do with the social capital that we're going to talk about a little bit later on. And so let's start with leadership at the community level. If we look at how we study community power structures, Harris in the 1950s really asserted this unified power structure that a lot of communities operated under, where a small group, a power elite in some small cities, and our focus in this course is the city of Bowling Green, and so it's basically a small city. And so this could be dominated by a single employer, a powerful individual, a tight grip by a small group of people who are reluctant to share power because it will dilute their influence and their authority. And so many company towns And Bowling Green's certainly not a company town. It's a university town, a college town, but many company towns, towns that have dominant forces, really had this. But one of the things that happens in a lot of the small cities that we'll study through the scope of this course is that you see a lot of this declining, with a lot of the declines in manufacturing and other types of the economies in these cities. And they're replaced with national firms that don't encourage interface at the community level. And so as a result, you begin to see a lot of communities with this power structure begin to decline or begin to cling to it. But that typically is characteristic of an unhealthy community. And this can happen formally, but it mostly happens informally, where these people are sort of pulling the puppet strings like the Great Oz behind the scenes. And so we want to look at the clustered power structure, or what is referred to sometimes as the pluralist theory of power, that comes from Dahl, who wrote one of the readings that you're reading about, Who Governs. And so if you look at his idea of a pluralist power structure, it's more like this upside down pyramid. Unlike power being concentrated at the top and the people at the bottom, this outer triangle represents the entire community, and the smaller triangle represents all the different organizations and factions, with larger influencers, but also smaller ones that play a role. And so there is a pluralism in this theory of power. And Dahl studied the city of New Haven, Connecticut, another college town where Yale is, and found that power was pretty widely dispersed among different groups. Of course, the university was one of those entities. And so in the late 1980s, you begin to see this debate about the power elite versus pluralism really come to fruition in another theory called the growth machine theory. And this is a theory from Logan and Molotov. And this idea is that most community power is really oriented around trying to find how we can get the city to grow at all costs. And so as a result, the land-based elites, developers, politicians, the media, utilities, anyone that will profit from land uses, ends up using that land as an exchange value with a pro-growth focus, whether it's retail, whether it's subdivisions, putting heads in beds, whether it's new manufacturing and industrial development. All of those things really become the basis of what they felt like was the power center in a lot of communities. And of course, the downside to this is it does put a lot of stress on environment. It creates land use issues, infrastructure issues, issues with schools, in managing that kind of growth, something that Bowling Green, I think, has seen. And so part of what we'll look at with Bowling Green is sort of the interface between this growth machine and this urban regime theory, the idea that came from Stone just a few years after this growth model. He studied Atlanta and the biracial coalition of the 1980s and the informal networks and adaptive coalitions that basically allowed Atlanta to be very successful without a power elite, but also without a pluralism and without just the growth theory. And so his thesis was that there were informal arrangements that support the formal workings of government and communities in a sort of a balance between influence versus control. The power elite wanted control. The urban regime model is more about what groups have influence. And so this balance of interest between the pro-growth corporate side and the progressive social production side led to levels of civic cooperation, informal arrangements, and what he refers to as the caretaking, or the balancing of interests of development versus the interests of residents. And what ultimately, ends up being sort of the public control of government balanced with the private control of resources, and how that really helps propel the community forward in a lot of ways. And so this really leads us to what is a paradigm in modern leadership. And, what, if you look at the book by Niall Ferguson here, his idea is that many historical, he looks at a whole host of historical episodes where there were turning points. And these turning points are often a collision between old power hierarchies and emerging social networks. And so it's very, very similar to the urban regime theory in the sense that these emerging social networks really serve as a balancer. And leaders, governments, and hierarchies sort of claim power from on high, but often that real power resided in the square. And so that's the tower being up on high where the governments were versus the square, which is the networks and coalitions, I think, that you see in things like the urban regime theory. And so the idea here is that the healthy, successful communities are those that are organized with factions and coalitions around problems and challenges, rather than just the leader and subordinates and this power center that really formed the old power elite model. And so the next focus that we'll get into is social capital, and that will be in our next lecture.